Welcome to Break the Rules with Dr. Lauren Lax, a podcast dedicated to quieting the noise in the health, food, and fitness world. Dr. Lauren is a leading nutritionist, therapist, and functional medicine practitioner on a mission to help others thrive in their own lives, mind, body, and soul. And now, your host, Dr. Lauren Lax.
Well, hello. Welcome to another edition of the Break the Rules podcast, where we talk about quieting the noise in the health, food, and fitness world. And today, super stoked to be talking about a topic that is really near and dear to my heart, because I am a birth child of many of the things, being how our birth story, our health story, our young childhood story really affects our health later on in life as adults, and perhaps some of the conditions that you may have. So whether it's autoimmune disease, gut microbiome disruption, IBS, or just kind of not feeling well, like feeling like you're hitting ceilings in your health from a hormonal perspective and energy perspective, even despite doing quote unquote all the things. You're eating right, exercising. Why are you not feeling great? Or why are you having a really hard time with resiliency and just going up-leveling your health to the next level? And a lot of that is rooted in our young, formidable years, childhood history, especially the first 2 years of life, which are super formidable and not always discussed when you go to a primary care, or even just given enough sometimes clout in a functional medicine or holistic practice, that there is a lot more focus perhaps on looking for the pathogens or fixing the hormones or optimizing your mitochondria, without realizing, like, hey, where are you coming from? And then what are some of the baseline essentials for changing your epigenetics, and epigenetically really modifying factors that can influence a new outcome for you and help you write a new story for your health. So got Dr. Catherine Clinton in the house, who is a certified naturopathic physician, speaker, and author, currently practicing in Eugene, Oregon, and who has several publications on topics of autoimmunity, gut health, and children's health. She's specializing in pediatric wellness with her business, Well Future. And this is something that has been near and dear to her heart, since she is working more from the ground up in the early stages and seasons of life, as well as with families, and really helping families as a whole optimize their health. So Dr. Catherine, thanks so much for coming on the show. And if you could just give us a little bit more background about who you are and what got you doing this work you're doing in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you about this, my favorite subject.
Yeah.
Yes, I actually started assisting with a local midwife here in town, and that got me really, really excited about the power of natural medicine. And of course, in midwifery, you're also using mainstream pharmaceutical medicine, but just to see the power of some of the herbs and some of the coaching that the midwife I assisted with did really set me on my path. So I did that for 5 years, and then I went to a naturopathic medical school. I graduated with my undergrad in philosophy, so I had to go back and do all my science and pre-med stuff. And that is where I got my training as a physician. And that's also where I got my training in stress and autoimmunity. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, Lyme disease. I was diagnosed with multiple different GI infections. So it was really sort of a great spot to be to be diagnosed with all those things. And as I worked through the different layers, I saw the same thing that I see in my patients now. So often our chronic health conditions are tied to something that happened in our childhood. And that childhood chronic stress or trauma really lays the foundation for what's happening in our biology, what's happening in our inflammatory pathway, what's happening in our gut microbiome, in our immune system. It really, really relies on that piece that is put into place in childhood. And it really comes down to that safety, whether we felt safe during our childhood or not. And as a parent, that can be hard to hear, but we know that most of that trauma is coming from outside forces and coming from so many different areas. But there are so many, the flip side is there are so many, even more possibilities for healing that trauma and that chronic stress and the inflammation and chronic disease and immune disorders that can come from it. So there's as much hope or more hope when we talk about trauma and early childhood events and stress. And so it's really, really something I'm passionate about.
Yeah, no, I just love something I really recognized in my own practice as well as my own life, as I've similarly had a story to you with the Lyme and just the chronic illness, autoimmunity presentation, which perhaps is why like spearheads our practice and our passion in these areas, but just like how much, again, the cards can be seemingly stacked against us early on, and just thinking like C-section baby here, formula fed, and just antibiotic kid, as well as a kid of the processed food generation when like kids' cuisines and Pop-tarts were really cool. That I never saw many vegetables except frozen broccoli with cheese sauce on them growing up. And so, and just not, I mean, it's not even a blame on parents. My mom didn't really know what she doesn't know. And so, and it's like greatly impacted my passion in this area as well. But maybe paint a picture for us of what are some of the things, like specifically early on, that do impact our health? And then we can also talk about what trauma is as well, because I know that is something that is a really big topic, but not really fully understood either. Like, what is trauma, of how those things can impact us as adults into our adult years and perhaps for a very long time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's start talking about trauma. So there are two kinds of trauma, and they are both included in the definition of trauma. So when we talk about trauma, we often think about the capital T trauma: loss of a loved one, abuse, neglect, fire, financial loss. But so much of what we're seeing today falls under a small t trauma: financial insecurity, divorce, bullying, racial injustices. I mean, there's so many different layers to what trauma can be. And when you put that into context of how we are dealing with that as a child, we also have to remember that our epigenetics really play a role in this. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when our parents and our grandparents are under extreme chronic stress or trauma, their nervous system gets wired in a certain way that's passed on generationally. So if they are experiencing stress and trauma and they're having that big dump of cortisol where they're becoming kind of hyperreactive and that stuck in that fight or flight zone, right? So stress or trauma can take the form of, for example, fight or flight is that response. A bear jumps out, our biology is flooded with cortisol and epinephrine, norepinephrine to get away from the bear. But when we're in a state of constant stress and trauma, we stay in that hypervigilant state. And after a while, that hypervigilance can't be maintained by our body for years and years. So it dips and there's an increase in inflammation that happens. And so, we're not only talking about what's happening to that child in the present day, we're also talking about what has happened to their family, what has happened to their ancestors, what is their stress response blueprint that they came into the world with, so to speak. So, trauma kind of has many different layers to it. And what we're seeing is that when a child is experiencing that chronic stress or trauma and they are not able to come from a place of resilience. So that means that they have that fight or flight response with the bear jumping in, and then they're able to run to the meadow and relax. And I'm speaking about that metaphorically, right? So what I mean is that they are able to encounter these chronic stresses and traumas in life and then bounce back and not get caught or stuck in a fight or flight or a freezing or a detachment trauma response. So what we're seeing is that a lot of that depends on your hereditary, right? Your genetics and your epigenetics. And so what's happening is when we see these children with these chronic stresses, what we see is a derangement of the gut microbiome. And it's really interesting. The research shows that these children experiencing chronic stress and trauma, their gut microbiome is deranged in a way that is completely different from their peers who also have sort of digestive upset but didn't have trauma. You know, it's very specific pattern to a chronic stress and trauma response that's not resolved. So that changes the balance in the gut microbiome. So it does a few things. It shifts the species of bacteria that are living in the gut microbiome and shifts them away from sort of those more beneficial species and towards more harmful species in the gut microbiome. It decreases our Treg cells. So when we eat resistant starches, lots of fruit and vegetables, we're feeding the gut microbiome short chain fatty acids. And that's the fuel they get. That is what they eat, right? They eat the stuff that we can't digest, all those resistant starches. So when at that time, that triggers an increase in Treg cells. And what T regulatory cells do is they shut down autoimmune condition or autoimmune responses. They shut down inflammatory responses. They shut down asthmatic responses. So they are really the peacekeepers of our immune system. And what we see with kids who are experiencing chronic stress and trauma is that they have that derangement of the actual microbes in the gut. They have the decrease of Treg cells, and they have an increase of inflammation. And this can last a lifetime, leading to an increase in autoimmune diagnoses, an increase in chronic diseases cardiovascularly, metabolic chronic diseases like diabetes. You know, the list goes on and on. It's really sets the whole foundation to what's happening in our biology. If we can't feel that safety in our lives, it really impacts every single process in our body. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, I'm like how you bring it up and how you define what trauma is, like beyond just like, I mean, to really getting hit by a car or like a really hard, significant loss, which are traumatic. And at the same time, like recognizing what are and exploring the traumas that we have in our own lives. I mean, do these traumas exceed beyond just like genetically, like our birth story and like our lineage? Thinking like, I don't know, like at age 9, 10, that's when my anorexia really started and my eating disorder days. And really remember that trauma is not feeling like I fit in. And that really led up, like was just a tipping point, fourth grade recess, being told I was 10 pounds heavier than the most popular girl at school. And just remember feeling like this dagger in my heart and belly that really drove me into a life of my young childhood years and teen years of so much stress, like mentally and physically, that I really think defined and shaped a lot of my health today as well. Talk a little bit about, like, since you are working with a lifespan, what are like kind of childhood traumas that can present in a child's life that like at that age, I was not able to process that or understand that or even recognize that as a trauma. But looking back on it, I can see like what a significant turning point in my life that was.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have a similar story. I grew up in the South, and my elementary school still had corporal punishment. So they were physically, taking
Oh,
kids out of the class and paddling them. And I came from a very nonviolent family, so the whole thing was just really traumatizing for me. And of course, I came into this world with a sensitive, epigenetic pattern
yeah.
of of trauma and stress. So I maybe wasn't as resilient as I could be. But we think of children experiencing trauma the way an adult would, and they don't. They, exactly like you said, we didn't have the words for it. We don't have the words and the experience to let adults and our parents know what's happening. I remember teachers trying to get me to say what was wrong, and I was so scared because they were the ones doing the paddling, and they thought that I was being abused at home because I just didn't have the words, and my parents thought I was having trouble adjusting to school. So oftentimes as parents, we see children struggling socially. We see the classic stomach hurt, stomach aches in response to some kind of trauma or stress. We can even see that in sleeping patterns and routine, having trouble sleeping, coming back to bedwetting patterns that haven't been an issue, but then they come up years later. There's all kinds of things that point to something's off with my child, but it's not something so specific and easy to bring to a doctor's office. It can be really hard to match a child's trauma response to an adult's trauma response, right? Because they just don't have the words. So a lot of a lot of that is going to be on the parents' plate or on educators' plates to really seek out some connection with these kids, give them a few minutes of safety so they can open up and explain what they're feeling. And that's what they need. They need just a few minutes of safety so that their nervous system can kind of relax and they feel comfortable sharing. Now, I do work with a lot of parents where we talk about ways to address this trauma and to start to heal it in our children without their direct participation, so to speak. So they're not actively putting words to their trauma and going through it and processing it in a way that an adult would. They are being given lots of safe space to kind of let their nervous system and their actual somatic physical body relax. And they're being supported in other ways. They're being supported with diet, they're being supported with vagal nerve tone, they're being supported with sort of what I call terrain theory and finding that safety in nature and in the world outside around us. So I'd say that to encourage parents. Sometimes it's hard to get our kids to talk about stress and trauma because they just don't have the words. And just because they don't have the words doesn't mean we should stop there. There's so many ways that we can address trauma that doesn't require that sort of, I'm doing my little air quotes here, but that adult processing of trauma. So that's really exciting. That's one of the things I love to talk to parents about because there are so many ways to come at it. We really live in this holographic kind of world. So I may come at it this way, you may come at it this way, but we're all doing the same thing and making that bridge to healing through trauma. There's so many different ways.
Do you have any just practical ways that, like in conversation starters or examples of ways to get kids to open up, or for parents who are just, yeah, wanting to explore this with their child?
Absolutely. One of the best ways to do it is through safe, loving touch. So finding a time when you can snuggle, finding a time when you can hug and connect on the couch. And then you can kind of open up the conversation with open-ended questions. How are you feeling? How is school? And you can kind of guide these questions and kind of match them to your child's response. So I'll share a little story. My youngest two are very vocal, very verbal. So doing something like this with them, where we maybe connect by reading a book, we snuggle together and read a book, and then I can kind of talk and open them up and see what's happening in their social circle and see, you know, see where their chronic stress is coming from. Now, my oldest, I remember doing the same thing, snuggling, and we were watching the Care Bears, a cartoon, the Care Bears, and they like to talk about their feelings. And so I, kind of leaned in and snuggled up, and I like to talk about my feelings. And she said, I don't.
Oh,
So, so that kind of response is common. And at that point, I stopped immediately because that's a very clear boundary. She didn't feel safe talking about it. So respecting those cues and those boundaries are really important when you're opening up these conversations. And when you do hit that boundary with a child, as a mother, my first instinct is to tear the boundary down and, no, we're going to talk about your feelings. But that's really counterproductive. And allowing that answer to be safe for the child, allowing that child to put up that boundary and maintaining it for the child creates a whole different kind of safety that we aren't even aware of. Safety in their nervous system, a safety in their somatic experience, what's actually being held in their muscles. So that's really important. As much as we want to get in there and fix it, I mean, that's why I became a doctor. I like to fix, I like to problem solve. But when a child says clearly, I don't want to talk about this, then I don't. And that allowed her to later open up. She knew that there was a space, a safe space for her, and that her boundaries would be respected. So a few years later, that allowed her to open up and process, and then we extended that processing to professionals. And there's all kinds of ways to do it, but I would encourage parents to start with a safe activity that kind of connects, that bonding, that attachment, whether it's snuggling, reading a book. If we were talking about my son, it could be a wrestling, giggling, tickle match, whatever it is that connects and gets your child to feel safe. That is a good point to start opening up that conversation. And if they shut it down, respect those boundaries, because they don't need to verbally process their traumas to overcome them and heal the things that have happened in their biology, that, the gut microbiome derangement and the inflammatory stuff, all that stuff. They don't need to process their trauma like an adult. They don't need to talk it out always. They can be supported with things like diet. They can be supported with things like neurofeedback. One of my favorite things to do with my patients, especially my young patients, is the Heart Math app. And that's just like it sounds, heart math, like 1+1 = 2. And the Heart Math Institute has been doing some amazing research out there about heart coherence and how that changes our vagal tone. And the neat thing about them is they have a lot of different exercises that are screen based. So you're hooked up to a little ear monitor or a finger monitor. Your heart rate variability is being tracked, and you play these games. So that's a really neat neurofeedback for kids. But that's one of many. There's so many things out there. Singing together helps increase the vagal tone, and that can help on the road to healing of trauma. I mean, there's so many things, tending to that vagal tone, tending to the gut microbiome, making sure that you're boosting those Treg cells, because not only do they help with inflammation and all those chronic health conditions that we're seeing associated with early childhood trauma, but they also help our resilience to present and future traumas and chronic stresses by way of the mitochondria. So it's really, it's just, there's so many options out there for helping our kids heal from trauma. I would just encourage parents to not get stuck on the talking it out, because that's probably the hardest part for our kids. They just, that's not how they do it.
Also well said, and not having to force as well. Talk a little
Yeah.
bit about now, like leaning into as adults, if we're the ones that are kind of like realizing, hey, I think I did have some like trauma, as most people do. I mean, we're humans, stress happens in life. But perhaps like wanting to explore how that impacts how they're feeling now, or perhaps their resiliency. What would you say are some ways for like overcoming or like becoming more resilient through and just in spite of the traumas that we did have? Like, can you write a new story for your health? And like, have you seen that effectively happen in your practice with folks turning over a new leaf once they recognize and just begin going in a different path?
100%. Absolutely. I've seen it in myself and my family and countless patients. I mean, we could count them, but lots and lots of patients. So it's absolutely, absolutely possible. And we have to remember that our body is so interconnected that we oftentimes as adults really focus on processing our trauma, healing our trauma through talk therapy, which is great. I'm This is not a bash on talk therapy. That is really important. But there are so many other ways. And processing trauma isn't just an intellectual thing. It's really a biological process as well. So I would encourage adults to start working on lots of different levels. I would encourage adults to not only seek out therapy or neurofeedback or somatic reeducation or tension releasing exercises. There's so much. I mean, even on YouTube, there are so many great exercises out there. And what needs to be said is that a lot of our stress and trauma is held in our actual physical tissues, our muscle tissues. Our body holds those memories in our physical body. So, doing things that I just mentioned, heart math, somatic reeducation, tension releasing exercises, has such a huge effect, regulatory effect on our biology. So, doing things like singing, gargling, chanting, those things can really help improve our vagal tone. And all of these things help improve our resilience to stress and trauma right now, but they also help unpack and heal the trauma that has already happened. And I'm just going to keep going here a little bit, because there's so much we can do. Like I said, that gut microbiome derangement can be reversed by eating those resistant starches. So resistant starches, onions, garlics, asparagus, leeks, they are so powerful for feeding that gut microbiome, and they've actually been shown to reverse that damage, or derangement, I should say. And the same thing can be shown for antioxidants, omega-3s. So a lot of this, if we made a graphic of things that we can do to help heal from trauma, it really can be boiled down to a lot of it can be boiled down to living in a way that we evolved as humans. So why in the world would omega-3s help us become more resilient to trauma? They did a study a couple years ago where they were studying trauma in newborns, and the trauma was newborns that were separated from their moms, right? So that gives you a first clue. that that was their measure of trauma. So they were looking at newborns that had been separated in the ICU, and they had the gut micro derangement that we see with those were reversed with omega-3 supplementation. And and that's just mind-blowing. I mean, is omega-3 the answer to trauma? Well, no. It's how we evolved as humans. We have evolved. The vast majority of our time here on earth we spent by water. We spent by waterways eating foods that have omega-3s in them. So it's become part of our resilience makeup to need those omega-3s, to need that antioxidant load every day, and as naturopathic physicians, we talk about eating a rainbow all the time, and it's sort of, trite when you say it like that, but it is so powerful to get those colors and those antioxidants in, because again, those have been shown to just getting those antioxidants in a study with veterans, PTSD, they were able to recount their traumas without the increase in blood pressure, without the increase in pulse rate, without those somatic responses to their trauma, from just by incorporating antioxidants into their diet. So we can see from the research that's emerging is that we often think of trauma as head down. Let's talk it out, let's fix it in our brains, but our body is working with trauma day in and day out. So when we support our biological systems and our body, our physiology, the damage that has been done by trauma begins to heal, and the resilience to future trauma begins to build. So that's what I'd like everyone to know, because it's not just this pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, get into therapy and do your mindfulness and, work it out, because so much of it is biological. So addressing our biology is a huge step forward in healing our trauma and building resistance to future trauma.
So well said, and so much meat there. Man, I could talk your ear off about it all. And Dr. Catherine, where can people find out more about you and the work you're doing in the world?
Yes, you can head to my website. It's drcatherineclinton.com. And I also have the website wellfuture.com. I'm transitioning more to my doctor's site so I can give people this information, because right now I can't think of anyone that doesn't need some resilience to chronic stress and trauma. Regardless if we haven't experienced any until now. I am passionate about that. And you can find me, I am sharing all of this stuff on social media. So you can find me at Dr. Catherine Clinton on Instagram and Facebook. And right now I'm in the middle of just that, talking about trauma and how it affects our brain and how it affects our vagus nerve and our immune system and what we can do about it.
Oh, I love the vagus nerve. You had me there. Awesome. I'll put links in the show notes. And thanks again so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing.